when we're trying to answer a big question like, hey, does God exist? Is Christianity true? Is Christianity true? Is the God that Christianity teaches, is that a real being that really exists? Well, this is an important question, and so I think it's natural for people to wonder, well, what counts as evidence in that case? What should we even be what facts should we even be considering to help us answer this big question? If we're looking at a simple question, like, hey, who ate the last popsicle out of the freezer? It's easy for us to see that, hey, there's going to be certain facts that are relevant to the case and certain facts which are not relevant at all. For example, like, hey, who was over at the house that day? Who had access to the freezer? Well, that's a fact, and it's relevant to the case because, well, those are all people who potentially are going to be our culprit of who ate the last popsicle. But there's other facts, like how many popsicles were produced in the U.S. that year? Well, it's a fact and it's about popsicles, but it's not really relevant to the specific question that we're asking. Whether the number of popsicles produced is not going to help us determine who ate the last one. So we can see that there's relevant facts, irrelevant facts, and typically the relevant facts are going to be what we describe as evidence. Those are the things that we would point to answer the question, who ate the last popsicle? When it comes to religion, though, and the question of God, I'll sometimes hear people say things like, well, you're making an extraordinary claim. This is a crazy claim that God exists, and so you better have some crazy, extraordinary evidence. Extraordinary claim needs extraordinary evidence. But I'm not sure if I fully follow where those people are coming from. I'm not sure what would really count as extraordinary evidence. Instead, I think it might be simpler, or maybe it helps us to be all on the same page if we think about things in terms of facts. What facts are relevant to the question? What facts are irrelevant? If we can say that certain things are irrelevant to our case, then we don't need to spend time on those. And the facts that are relevant to the case, those are things we should focus on to help us answer the question. So whether the fact is big or small, if it is relevant to the question, we should be looking at it. It's potentially meaningful whether we personally perceive it as extraordinary or not. We may want a certain piece of evidence, but ultimately, we are only faced with the evidence we can actually find, the actual facts around us. We don't get to decide whether we like the quality or the type of evidence that we have. We just have to answer the question with what we're given, with what exists, with what is known. So when it comes to the question of God, the question of God has very far-reaching implications. If God exists, if the God of Christianity exists, then He created all of the universe, all time, space, and matter. The Big Bang is caused by this God. And so a lot in the natural universe might be considered relevant to this case because everything in time, space, and matter would have been created by this being and therefore might speak to their existence. So it's not necessarily that the question of God is more is different in kind than the question of who ate the last popsicle. It's just that it has a broader base, or there's many more potential pieces of known information that might speak to the question. It's just that there's a broader base of relevant facts that might help us answer this question. And it might even be a minority, a small amount of things which would be irrelevant to this question. But when we're evaluating it, we're just trying to ask, hey, what's relevant and what's irrelevant to the case? If we think about our own knowledge, most of our learning has come from two kind of big categories, training and experience. Training, that's the stuff that we learned from someone else. Like we read it in a book, a textbook, a encyclopedia, we read it on the internet. We saw somebody give a talk, some type of authoritative source gave a lecture in a class, or we watched a documentary. We learned information that we didn't know firsthand. We didn't experience the information we're learning, but we still learned it. And it's still true whether we personally experienced it or not. And then there's that second group, our actual experience. These are the things that we had hands-on knowledge of. We saw it with our own eyes. We conducted the experiment ourselves. That's our first-hand experience. The majority of our knowledge is probably that first group, the training. But it's all knowledge. Most of the facts we might know about life, we had to trust somebody else to tell us about, but it doesn't make it more or less true than the things we learned or experienced ourselves. But everything in training experience, that's the breadth of our own knowledge. And the vast majority of those facts that we would have known might have some type of bearing on whether Christianity is true. See, we want to ask this question about what is the most reasonable answer in light of the evidence, in light of all the relevant facts. Is it more reasonable to believe that God exists, or is it more reasonable to believe that he does not exist? So, when you talk to a Christian, they might give you different answers for why they believe God exists, or you might even talk to the same Christian, and on different days they might make a slightly different argument, because the Christian is coming from a place that the majority of human knowledge may inform our understanding of whether a God exists or not. Hey, how are we going to explain all this information? We have a universe that exists that appears to have come out of nothing. There appears to be design in this universe. There's moral laws. There's certain ways that people should behave. There's right and wrong. There's consciousness. There's a lot in human knowledge that we need to account for, or that might speak to this question. So how do we explain it? How do we explain the universe that we see around us, our own daily lives? Is it more reasonable to believe that God exists or that God does not?